Good day, everyone, and welcome to a special pre-conference session of Stanford Social Innovation Review's 2021 Data on Purpose Conference, Democracy, Civil Society, and Digital Technology. I'm Michael Voss, publisher of SSIR, and I'm pleased that so many of you could join us for this session, Syndemic Crises, Philanthropy, and Civil Society, a discussion of Blueprint 2021, led by my colleague, Lucy Bernholz, director of the Digital Civil Society Lab at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Thanks to the generous support of Stanford PACs, this session has been open to any interested individuals, regardless of whether or not they are registered for Data on Purpose. And we're glad that we're able to do this for such an important discussion as the one about to start. For over 10 years, Lucy Bernholz has been producing the Blueprint Report, an annual industry forecast about the ways we use private resources for public benefit in the digital age. Each year, the Blueprint provides an overview of the current landscape, points to big ideas that matter, and directs your attention to horizons where you can expect some important breakthroughs in the coming year. Her 2021 edition includes a powerful argument that we're in the midst of several intertwined and mutating crises that reveal the fragilities and fissures in the US and urges philanthropy and civil society to reconsider their purposes, practices, and roles in contributing to positive change. A self-described philanthropy wonk, Lucy is the author of numerous articles and books about civil society, philanthropy, and technology, including Disrupting Philanthropy, Creating Philanthropic Capital Markets, The Deliberate Evolution, and How We Give Now, Philanthropy by the Rest of Us. She's the co-editor of Philanthropy and Democratic Societies and Digital Technologies and Democracy Theory. Her award-winning blog, philanthropy2173.com, was chosen by Fast Company magazine as one of its best blogs, and the Huffington Post named Lucy a game changer for her ideas about the future of philanthropy. Lucy has a BA from Yale University and an MA and PhD from Stanford. As part of today's session, Lucy will be joined by several other notable leaders in social innovation and civil society who Lucy will introduce. Before we begin, a couple of notes. Lucy and our other speakers want to hear your thoughts, so please feel free to use the chat function to do so. They'll also be taking questions, so feel free to start entering those in the Q&A at any time. You can also use the Q&A for any technical issues that you may be experiencing, and a member of our team will try to assist you. Now enough of me, let me pass things over to Lucy.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, afternoon, evening to all of us joining here. Thank you so much to SSIR and the Data on Purpose Conference for making this conversation possible. To begin, I want to thank and acknowledge the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, the original stewards and caretakers of the land that Stanford occupies today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Borrowing from a land acknowledgement, I believe that was developed at Data in Society in New York. I'd also like to note that Stanford University, while it was founded on the ancestral territory of the Muwekma Ohlone people, in one of the many communities of what we now call the San Francisco Bay Area, this conversation is made possible because we are connected via a vast array of servers and computers that are also situated on stolen land. We acknowledge the dispossession of indigenous land by the data-driven logic of white settler expansion and uplift the sovereignty of indigenous people and data. We commit to dismantling the modern day colonialism and its material implications for our digital worlds. It's an important way to begin this conversation. I also want to note that I am a very pale, middle-aged white woman with gray hair. I am wearing red eyeglasses and a blue shirt and sweater, and behind me is a mostly black with red lettering logo of the Digital Civil Society Lab. I'm going to ask each of my conversational colleagues here to briefly introduce themselves, providing a brief visual description as well, and then we will jump right into the conversation. So I'm delighted to be joined by three colleagues I've known for several years and who, among many, many other people, are always instrumental in pushing my imaginary, improving my own work. And in this past year, over the lifetime of the Blueprint, these three individuals stand among others who've been absolutely critical to that thinking. Let me first introduce my colleague and friend, Jara Dean-Coffey, who is from the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. Jara, will you introduce yourself, please?
Great. So I'm just going to introduce myself visually. I think bios and everything have already been provided. So I am a middle-aged Black woman. I'm coming in at about a 55% dark chocolate, but my preference is about a 73 dark chocolate. So if you see me in June or July, if I can get to Cabo, I'll be significantly darker. I have all 3A types of curly hair. So if you know anything about curly hair, I've got 3A, 3B, and 3C. I am developing what I like to think of as a mane of silver, and I'm wearing a white sweater. And I have on what are probably a cross between Buddy Holly and Ted Bundy glasses.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jara. It's really great to be here. My other colleague here, one of my other two colleagues here is Mario Lugay, the critical founder of a site called Giving Side, and also a leader at Justice Funders. Mario, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Lucy. I also want to just introduce myself visually, but maybe just add in, I am a big fan of Lucy's and follower of Blueprint, so appreciate this opportunity. I am a middle-aged male with Filipino brown complexion, long black hair, the length of the pandemic, as I used to have a buzz cut, and black rim glasses and a gray crew neck under a black and white checkered blazer. Behind me is just a screenshot of a purple PowerPoint slide, which represents the colors of Justice Funders and includes splashes of pink and orange and yellow that are part of our logo. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mario. And I believe both Jara and Mario are also on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people, but joining us from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people is a colleague of mine, Divya Siddarth, who delighted, Divya, that you could join us. Divya and I have worked together for 5 or so years on issues related to digital security, digital technology, and activism. Divya, I'm really glad you could join us today. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Delighted to be here, and one of my greatest inspirations as always, so very excited for these conversations. I'll also introduce myself visually. I suppose we could all be of middle age, but I am probably quite a bit younger
than you're nice.
Some of the folks on this call. I have purple hair. I am an Indian woman wearing a blue turtleneck with a extremely basic Zoom background that I just downloaded for this call to not show all the flowers I currently have in my room as a disaster behind me, and very excited for this conversation.
Thank you, Divya. And I'm delighted to see that people are beginning to introduce themselves in the chat. This really is a conversation. I'm going to do my best multitasking possible to engage you. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat by whatever you feel is important. One of the other things that I believe that I'd like to acknowledge before, as we get this conversation, is that no conversation comes out of nowhere. I and my colleagues, I know, are influenced by many others. There are many people who have moved me forward in my political journeys, including the people on this call, but mostly I'd like to shout out a very important person in my life who just celebrated his 70th birthday, Femi Asoke, who is the leader of the Social Justice Center at Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco, and has been an absolute tree in my life as I've grown over the last 30 years since I've lived on this coast. I invite you to introduce yourself, shout out someone important to you or on whose shoulders you stand, or whatever you feel will help us make this as conversational and connected as possible. So as I mentioned, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about the blueprint, although what we're really going to do here is have a conversation among friends. The key theme of the questions I will ask my colleagues do draw from this analysis of our present moment. I don't think it's just this year or just last year, in which we have really come to feel those of particularly people who have always lived on one side of a divide that allowed them to thrive, allowed them to have power, And so therefore, I've often thought the divide did not exist. But what 2020 certainly made clear is what is known in medical anthropology as a syndemic of crises. And the official term of the definition of a syndemic is when a new pandemic finds home in a system already broken by systemic endemic failures. The term actually comes from the AIDS, when AIDS was a new phenomenon in humanity. And certainly over the last, since the outbreak of the coronavirus, the US system, which has been defined by white supremacy and racism, enormous income and wealth inequalities, as well as settler colonialism and a rather wide stripe of misogyny, gets hit with something like coronavirus. What you see, what you experience, and many of us experience this all the time anyway, is that the response is racialized, unequal, and unjust. The real experience that I wanted to raise up as an unescapable reality for philanthropy and civil society with last year's blueprint, or this year's blueprint, I don't know what year it is that these fissures that have been revealed to those who live on one side of them every day, those who benefit and therefore don't act to change, benefit from them and don't act to change them, are ever with us. And unless you are actively working to change them, you're actually making them worse. These include inequitable healthcare, education, digital access, the very systems that prop up these inequities. As philanthropy and civil society spend a lot of time thinking of themselves as parts of solutions, I think it's ever more important that we investigate both the degree to which they are part of the problem, as well as how they can change to be part of the solution. So the big question is, where do philanthropy and nonprofits fit in? Are they propping up racial and economic inequality, or are they seeking to repair them? And these three colleagues, Jara, Mario, and Divya, are critical actors in that space. They stand among many others. And one thing I would ask, if you do me the honor of looking at the blueprint, which I believe there's been a link dropped, is the most important part of the blueprint, I think, is the where to go for more section. Because everything I have to say is informed by the work, character, insight, wisdom, and long-held arguments by many, many others. And a couple of pages of those influences are shouted out in the blueprint. Of course, there's many, many more, and I hope they'll join in the conversation. One last thing before we get going. A lot of people know the blueprint for the buzzword section because it's the quickest and easiest thing to read. So if you, throughout this conversation, at least, I don't know if my colleagues will indulge me, I'm going to be dropping some of the blueprint buzzwords into the questions and the conversation. Each time you hear one, drop it into the Q&A, not into the chat, and I'll shout out the first person to do so as I see it. And we'll also be taking questions by the Q&A. I'd offer you a prize, but I don't know what that would be. So let's see what it will be. We'll come up with some prizes. So there we go. We'll have a little game of buzzword bingo while we get this conversation going. So enough of me. Jara, Mario, and Divya, let's get started. You all know that how we frame problems has a big influence on how we go about addressing them. It shows up in Jara's work on equitable evaluation, Divya's thinking about governing digital systems, and Mario's work with justice funders. What knowledge frameworks are EEI, community governance, and justice funders building from, and how are you engaging nonprofits and philanthropy as you do that work? And just for the sake of popcorning here, I'll start with Jara, then go to Mario, and then Divya, but trust me, I'll shake that up as we go through the conversation. So Jara?
Great, thank you, Dr. Bernholz. So I love this question because it acknowledges, so Lucy smiles every time I say Dr. Bernholz, and I do that intentionally just to make her slightly uncomfortable. So it's a deliberate, by the way. I love this question because it actually acknowledges that there are knowledge frameworks, which I think is something that we in this country, and my work is primarily in the United States of America, which I now refer to as a federated set of states, right? Because we're not united by any stretch of the imagination. It acknowledges that there are knowledge frameworks. And so I I work with a very small yet powerful group of individuals in philanthropy, and I refer to it as the US settler-created industrial complex. And I use those words purposely because I think it's important for us to name so we can decide if it still serves us. So Lucy referred to the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, and hopefully someone can drop that into the chat for me. What we're interested in is actually reclaiming the implicitness of the current Western knowledge framework, which is pretty white, pretty male, highly capitalistic, and actually introducing some dimensions which reflect the multiplicity of the human experience and intelligence and different ways of knowing. And so we are a 5-year initiative. We started in 2019. We will sunset in 2023. We're sunsetting on purpose. We may turn into something else, remains to be seen. It's up for the field to decide what that looks like. And so it's very invitational. We're inviting folks into understanding how evaluation in particular showed up in US philanthropy and whether it still holds true as meaningful, relevant, and actually truthful. So that's some of the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Jara. And embedded in that, I'll just comment and then pass it over to Mario. You didn't use the P word, but you're talking about power.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely.
Just make sure I'm hearing
Absolutely.
that correctly, right? And just one more thing before Mario, someone in the chat would like to know, they said, I'd love to hear that name again, the US settler blank, blank, blank industrial.
Yeah, I'm putting it in it.
Okay, you got it.
Yes,
You see,
yes.
multitask away. Mario, tell us about justice funders and when you hear knowledge frameworks, what you're thinking of.
Sure. The framework within which Justice Funders finds purpose and direction is Movement Generation Strategy Framework for a Just Transition. And additionally, for this audience, the Resonance Framework is one that we developed with the constellation of movement and philanthropic leaders as an offering to the community of how philanthropy can work towards a just transition. But Lucy, I'm a little nervous about this. If I may, and inspired by 3 texts, Blueprint 2021, Arundhati Roy's essay, which she referenced a few times, and actually this past week's article by Stacey Abrams and Lauren Groh-Wargo in the New York Times, and maybe Godzilla. I'd like to offer a future scenario that we might find on the other side of the portal, the proverbial portal, and what we might be able to build a 10-year plan towards. And so what I hope is on the other side, that maybe the 4 of us here can walk through the portal and find ourselves at the conclusion of a first ever meeting of movement leaders from across the country in the year 2031. From the front of the room, the speakers on stage reaffirmed the following 2 truths. One, that financial resources are certainly important to movements. It's actually people's individual and collective civic and political journeys that give life and dynamism and power to social movements. And it is social movements that have historically brought about leaps in human progression towards a more just and more caring world. And that in 2031, spurred by accelerated donor organizing efforts over the last decades, movement in this country have never had access to as much financial resources as they do today. The speakers would then continue, given this, we have decided the following. 1, that we have enough. The cost of the continued belief in our own scarcity of financial resources and in the centering of financial resources as the condition for us winning is simply too high. That because of this, starting today, we'll begin the process as we had planned in 2021 to begin to convert the 20 to 40% of our time we currently spend fundraising with a solely financial metric back to power building. That we call on our friends currently working in philanthropy, whether within foundations or intermediaries, to similarly draw down work providing philanthropists with exclusive services and support, and that we will fully support our friends in their continued pursuit of meaningful and passion-driven work, purpose, and possibly even public service. And finally, we will let foundations and high net worth donors know that after submitting our final reports, we will no longer be applying for additional money. If last year was an opportunity to bring our proverbial house back down to its studs for us as a country to reckon with, perhaps it also revealed that philanthropy, given its accumulation of wealth via extractive labor and laws tilted towards obscene accumulation rather than redistribution, might be better understood as discovering that someone has tapped into each one of our water supplies, siphoning it off, only to then allow us to apply for the possibility to receive a portion of it back. Simply put, we would much rather that our water no longer be siphoned off. please know we want to free foundations and high net worth donors and everyone from any notion that their capital needs to be their currency to join movements and find guides on their political journey. We want to liberate them from an unfortunate identity of philanthropists and the continued tying of who they are and the good that they can do in this world to how much capital they continue to have access to. We invite them to again be in communion with us in cross-class multiracial sites of collective action and belonging and transformation. And we acknowledge that capitalism can be corrosive and brutal even for those with the greatest access to capital. To be clear, we are not rejecting additional resources. If this is the assumption, then that in itself shows the insidiousness of philanthropy and codependence that it seeds, planting the idea that we must labor for another in order for generosity to flow. Instead, it is our hope that their giving continues, perhaps modeled off of how those who give significantly, particularly middle class, working class folks, give. Philanthropy no longer needs to draw more time, talent, and attention away from the demanding but regenerative work of transforming ourselves and our relationships with one another and the planet. The speaker then finally brings this session to a close by affirming, we collectively choose to do this for the love of the fundraiser and the difficult choices they have had to make between the retired librarian, for example, offering their time, talent, and treasure, and the program officer offering an opportunity to apply for the possibility of a grant. For the love of our friends in philanthropy, working for our communities, but often pulled away far from them into imbalanced spaces of power and privilege, and for the love of philanthropists themselves taught that their safety could be found in their wealth instead of our collective well-being. We do this for the love of theirs and our collective humanity. That's all.
Mario, thank you. Thank you so much for that. There's a whole many conversations in there. I think I want to get to Divya, but the thing that always, or the element of all that you've said that I find so, that's been transformative for me personally is the shift from scarcity to abundance. It's almost, that alone is enough to open up whole new imaginaries. And what you do so beautifully is open up whole new relationships. So I hope we'll get back to some of your work. There's some questions for you in the chat, and I'll ask people also to put those in the Q&A. Divya, tell us about where you're coming from in terms of this question of knowledge frameworks and how it shapes what you do.
If you'll permit me, I will ideate a little bit on this in the panel because I think there's so many synergies between what I'm looking at in terms of community governance and democratization of technology and all of the incredible things we've heard today. Mario, that was such a beautiful vision, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. I think, there is sort of a knowledge framework inherent in democratizing a space, or at least in an effective way of doing that, which is that everyone's knowledge is important, and a well-designed, co-created system brings out that knowledge and allows people to work together and construct decisions that are good for the community. I think that is a knowledge framework that is inherent when we talk about anything being democratized. And there are some functional ways to engage philanthropy and nonprofits in that process, whether that is through building out structures for community stewardship, I think in all forms, across technology, across financial resources, land, voice, power, transferring ownership to communities to allow for this knowledge framework to really flourish and for us to work within a system that doesn't just pay lip service to this type of democratization framework, but really understands that what we are saying when we want to democratize something is that this is the way knowledge is distributed, and it's the same way that decisions and voice and resources should be distributed. I really liked the point I think Jara made, or I've been reading the Equitable Evaluation Framework, so maybe I'm just conflating what you said here with my homework, but around there needing to be multiple truths that we all listen to and understand and hold. And I think that is one of the great strengths, but also difficulties of democracy, is that it's not about finding the efficient path forward. It's not about making the right decision constantly. It's about holding multiple truths and understanding that in that knowledge framework that underlies, our process of democratizing systems, those multiple truths exist and must and can coexist. And in building towards all of them at once, we shift from our extractive modality into our regenerative modality. And I think this, is something that we can understand on the abstract level, but it's also work that is happening every day on a very concrete level, where I know we're going to talk about tech and data and public goods and systems later, but I think community stewardship is a process that can be undertaken today, that we can talk to civil society organizations and philanthropic organizations today and think about transferring that power to communities. And I think traditionally, philanthropy is moving in this direction, but originally philanthropy was the most top-down kind of distribution of resources there was, right? And I think there's a great point in Blueprint this year that philanthropy cannot be a stand-in for public services, and nor should it be. And yet, when our public services are failing us, how do we leverage philanthropy and civil society to at least build up the governance frameworks and the community stewardship frameworks and the public goods, public infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, all of that, to allow for those public services to flourish? And I think there's a real pipeline there. So I'm excited to get to that part of the conversation, but that's sort of what I would add as my synthesis of some of what's been discussed today.
Thank you, Divya. And, this is a conversation, so we're going to sit here for a second, if that's okay with my colleagues. A couple of things. I mentioned the mind shift from scarcity to abundance and how powerful that's been. And I know it draws on centuries of Black feminist thought, as well as indigenous knowledge frameworks, to use that language. But one of the other things both Jara, Mario, and Divya also, I'm hearing from you is a really, a very powerful rejection, if you will, and correct me if I'm hearing this wrong, of knowledge as this external object, and instead positioning it as a set of relationships, as relational, that knowledge is relational. This is so completely out of sync with things like artificial intelligence right now, or the digital world, which is driven on rationality as knowledge, and knowledge is this objective other, that it's really very powerful. And it's not just my own curiosity that makes me want to check that understanding with you. We have a question. Oh, there we go. We have a question that has disappeared from my screen now. No, there it is. From someone, an anonymous attendee, who asks, and I think you might have some thoughts on this, for advice on adopting these frameworks inside of organizations, and I'm quoting here, that want to adopt, in quotes, equity frameworks, but not necessarily racial equity or decolonizing frameworks. Specifically, I'm thinking about data and evaluation as one person on a data team who comes from a colonized people. And I see that Jara has put some answers to that already in the Q&A, but if either Mario, Divya, or Jara wants to elaborate on that, because if we're going to get from this conversation to helping people make change, let's do that.
Yeah. So I'd love to start with that. So one of the things that I did really intentionally when I began this work in 2017, when we were still talking about diversity, barely talking about inclusion, and certainly weren't talking about racial, let alone equity, is we named it the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, because in this set of federated states, if you talk about equity, you will get to race. So, and it's one of the things I talk about all the time with people that come to EEI, is that equity transcends all identities. And because of the ways in which we've constructed data and information in this federated set of states, it's incredibly male, white, and middle America, right? So our understanding of what is limited by that gaze pretty significantly. Our truths are sometimes lies, and at most they're not accurate, full truths. So I think there's a really interesting and often compelling way to talk to folks, not necessarily about equity. You can, if that gets you in the door, but if not, you can just say, we actually don't know what we think we need to know. We're not as smart as we think we are, because we see so little of what really is. Our desire for simplicity is in control, which is part of the settler mindset, right? has completely limited our ability to actually really understand most anything. Yeah. And data is an expression of that.
Yeah. The reduction.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
think
Divya.
to add to that briefly, I really like that last point. And to me, I think emphasizing collaboration and cooperation over autonomy in the way we define knowledge, but also in the way we think about our work is a crucial part of this. Lucy, you brought up artificial intelligence. I think that's kind of a stand-in for the logic of the place that technology takes us, which is not only currently, centralizing or power concentrating in the sense that there are monopoly firms, or, in the sense that there's massive wealth inequality, although all of those things are true. But I think it's more also that the logic of the technology that we are building is inherently centralizing, and is inherently autonomous, and is inherently thinking about knowledge in this separate way. And that's also true of the systems we build around that technology. And it's often true of, even the systems we build to counter that technology can fall into this kind of logic. And so I think, a big piece of my work and a lot of the communities that I come from here is emphasizing collaboration and cooperation over this type of autonomy, exactly what Jara was saying about, we are not going to let ourselves be constrained by these kinds of logics that we are building under, and instead go out and try to bring together different communities and try to measure ourselves by how much we have been able to cooperate, how much we've been able to collaborate, how much we've been able to increase capacity, rather than measuring ourselves by, more autonomous types of markers of progress.
Wonderful. Thanks,
Great,
Divya. Mario, is there anything you want to add here, or nope? Okay, so diving from Divya's response and the questions that are being asked, I'm going to shift us into some of the nerdier policy data elements of this discussion. We're just going to go there, folks. I put forth in the blueprint under my own name some policy suggestions about taxes, quite frankly, aimed at addressing the rampant wealth inequality in the US. I feel very strongly that in the US context, philanthropy and not-for-profits, as they see themselves as a sector, others are beginning to call them out for what they really are, which are industries. Their special interest politics are making the problems worse. They're not making the problems better. And it's ridiculous for us to be fighting over $300 tax exemptions and not fighting over the wealth end of the tax spectrum. So happy to have a nerdy conversation about fiscal policy if anyone wants to have that. But I'm curious, I'm not curious, I'm desperately invested in understanding from the three of you, beyond fiscal policy, what suggestions you make to donors and doers about how to reset how we take action to address some or all of these syndemic crises. I mean, where do we start? And if you had two things to say to some group or some decision maker who could change things quickly, what would you say? And let's start this one with Mario, and then go to Divya, and then Jara.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to say, my favorite people and favorite things in the whole world are both nerdy and political. I'll start by saying a favorite organizing quote of mine is from the author of The Little Prince, who said, to paraphrase, if you want someone to set sail, don't give them tools or teach them shipbuilding skills, and instead make them long for the immensity of the sea. People are capable of incredible things, given the opportunity, but also the desire. And so my first suggestion, particularly coming out of 2020, is to pursue parallel strategies of acting right now because of the urgency, but also of working to deepen your desire to participate in shaping our collective history. To beware of advice you might find coming out of philanthropy or tech that promises to make doing good frictionless, which often goes something like identify your values, decide on how you want to act on those values, then look for, compare, contrast, and finally select groups to give money to. While perhaps well-intentioned, it's an approach defined by individualism, isolation, consumption, and othering, where a person places themselves at the center of a worldview where they are the benefactor, seeking out beneficiaries. Instead, to truly deepen your desire, opt for more communal approaches that lean towards shared discovery and exploration, towards relationships full of ritual, full of practice, full of friction, and of endless possibilities for mutual transformation. In time of hyper choice, value connection over any sense of a need for perfection. Find people who may share your unsustainable feelings of anger, sadness, grief, or outrage about the world, but who have also found ways to have those paired with more sustainable feelings of joy, purpose, and community. Then allow yourself to fall in love with who you are when you're with them. So many of the leaders now being lifted up, being retweeted, like Stacey Abrams, Alicia Garza, Latasha Brown, have grown deep roots below the surface of what most people see and know, done over years of patient, dedicated work. Deepen your desire by simply growing roots in shared social movement soil, opting for civic and political journeys prompted by better questions that ask things like, whose suffering and whose strength do you want to honor? Whose legacies and whose futures? Who do you want to be proud of you? Who do you want to become? And with whom do you want to engage the world? I think we face a particular challenge in times when information is being made readily available and when readily available information feels like the end goal. Imagine the grandchild who once would have asked their grandparents for help with their history homework, learning history through a familial lens, hearing stories about their parents at their age, but who now instead finds history at their fingertips alone in front of a screen. Civil society has faced similar loss because the process by which information was shared, as you all have mentioned, particularly by advocates, activists, organizers, and community members coming together, always mattered more than the information being shared itself. Which leads to my second suggestion, which is find a political home. While we appreciate everyone's individual actions, in some ways they don't matter. What matters most is your individual actions and relationships aggregated over a lifetime, then aggregated with those of others, combining together. A political home is a place that our civic and political identities have the room to breathe, where they get socialized and where they change and grow and evolve. It's where you could find that type of love you find at home when homes are at their best, that sees in you possibility you might not see in yourself and challenges you to become more than you were yesterday. A political home, to be clear, can be forever or for a period of time. It could be an organization, but it could also just be a giving circle, a friend, a partner. It's the place you go whenever big things happen in the world to understand what's happening and what our individual and collective response might be. Sometimes I think everything bad is simply the result of some sort of fragmentation of a pulling apart of ourselves individually, collectively, culturally, historically. Finding political homes throughout our lives can be an important, perhaps glorious way just to weave us back together again. Those are my two suggestions.
Fabulous. Thank you, Mario. You're getting a lot of shout outs and respect in the chat. So take a second to look over there. Don't miss it. Divya, your thoughts on tactics to change?
I love, I've had the privilege of following Mario's beautifully poetic sections twice now, and I think it makes me want to comment on that rather than go with what I was originally going to say. But I love the idea of finding a political home, and I think that ties into what my suggestion was going to be, which is we need to be creating, funding, and governing those kinds of political homes, and particularly through public goods. I think what we are really lacking in this country and across, where we've seen the pandemic hit is what are our collective resources that we have shared stewardship over, and how do we create those collective resources, govern them, have ownership over them, build communities around them, build communities within them, and all of those kinds of things. And I think public goods are generative and not extractive, in a sense that much of the other structures that we build end up being extractive and not generative, end up being siloed in some sense, end up being walled off from many groups. And the more we can do our learning and our growing and our resource collection in public, in the commons, I think the more we have to share and the more we have to build our political homes with, I think we need to provide ourselves with that material. And that material must come out of publicly governed goods across the board, whether that's public technology, public infrastructure, from the very offline, parks and community spaces, to the very online, like public social media platforms. Universal broadband, I think, is, things like this that are really a basic part of how we connect with each other, that are now outside of the public realm entirely. I think we sometimes underappreciate how much of our most basic resources and decisions are abstracted away from us. And this is something that we can work on now and in the future. I think I see, in line with Mario's vision, a very beautiful world 10, 20 years from now, where we do have all of these things in the public space, but we can start building that now with universal broadband, with, public parks and infrastructure, with community meetings. And there is investment needed at this point to make that happen. And I think in some sense, that is a boon for the philanthropy community, which is trying to find its identity in this new world and trying to do good. Funding public goods is, I believe, the way forward for that. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Divya, and thanks for drawing in from Mario's comments as well. I think the relationship between philanthropic dollars and public goods and governance and control are certainly would be a very different place to start if we were to start those or continue those conversations from the wisdom that was shared earlier about whose strengths are you trying to honor, whose understandings are you trying to lift up, and not sort of the way we live in these kind of petrified, rigidified understandings of public and private. Jara, you get another nothing that you want to add?
I think that was more than enough for our heads, hearts, and hands to take in.
Great. Let me put one more question to the group, and then I'm trying to weave in some of the stuff from the Q&A as I go, but also encourage people to put more in the Q&A so I can bring that to my colleagues here. But the conference that's hosting this conversation is called Data on Purpose. We've touched on this a little bit, but if there's anything in particular you want to add, and I'll modify this question to pull in some from the chat as well. The question was originally is, where does data fit into your work? What do people actually, what do you understand when you think about this phrase, data on purpose? And what is the necessary digital infrastructure to achieve those goals? Now, we've talked about some of that already, but weaving in a question from an anonymous attendee. If whether anyone here has any thoughts on how, and they state this as a how, I'd state it as an if, digital spaces have facilitated equitable philanthropy during the pandemic. So this is really bringing us to the topic of data and digital systems and this thing called civil society in this time. Who have I not? I haven't started with you, Divya, but I just ended with you. But I'll start with you again, and then we'll keep the circle going. That way you don't have to follow Mario.
It is a joy to follow Mario. But I'll speak quickly because I really want to hear from Jara and Mario on this question. I think I spend too much of my time thinking about data governance and very excited to hear other perspectives. But, I think the first thing to remember with regards to data is that it is created by us and we should have ownership over it. And I think that's something that's often, it's so obvious that it's often forgotten that a lot of the major platforms and everything that we live under, these were built with human labor, basically, whether that's, exploited data labor through things like Amazon Mechanical Turk, or it's unintentional passive extraction that we go through every day as we go about our lives and have this taken from us. So I think an understanding of data as a product of human intention, knowledge, expertise, labor, and something that we're not asking for. We're asking for what is ours back and ownership over that, rather than trying to construct new modalities entirely of looking at data. When we talk about this, I think is really important. In terms of whether online spaces have been positive for organizing during the pandemic and organizing philanthropy, I think I will definitely hand it over to Jara and Mario, who have way more expertise on the philanthropy side. But I think a lot of the incredible political work that has happened has been on and despite many of the digital platforms that we all live under and with. And, I think a lot of these platforms have been used to great effect, but it is not because that's what they were designed to do. It's in fact what they were not designed to do. And if we instead had tools, as we talked about, with the last question, if we instead had tools that were distributed, that were collaborative, that were publicly owned, that were community stewarded, infrastructure for data commons, infrastructure for collaboration, all of that, then the kind of work that we could do on those platforms would dwarf what we are able to do now. And so I think due to the incredible, indomitable spirit, of the folks who are constantly working on the ground, community groups, et cetera, of course, there's been amazing work done on the digital infrastructure we currently have, but it is often working against the logics of that digital infrastructure. And if we instead were able to build something that worked within the world we want to create, then I think the kind of work we could do would be exponentiated.
Jara.
Thank you, Divya. That was great. So one of the things I've learned being of this season in life is, and looking like this, is I know my lane. And I'm very mindful about where I have agency and where I have influence. So I always tend to purposefully bound my work where I have cachet. So I work in a very small part of the settler created environment that we live in, which is US-based philanthropy, although we are having some interest in the UK and Brazil and beyond, which is fantastic, and some other disciplines. And even within that, those that come to EEI, which is an invitation, come because they've had what I refer to as an aha, oh no moment, where they recognize that they are complicit, that the sustainability of our world and the viability of this species is compromised by our short-sightedness, by our selfishness, by our cruelty, and by a preoccupation with control and money. And so folks that come to us and play with us have already done some of the work, and they are ready to chart new paths forward. And that usually they've had an internal conversation. So when asked, what do I do or we do, it's to cultivate that willingness to imagine that which has never been imagined or intended before. I was actually having a conversation with one of my colleagues, and she says, you need to know what's going to happen in 3 years. And I said, I actually don't. I actually don't need to know what's going to happen in 3 years. What I need to do, if I'm good, is to cultivate a group of people who in 3 years will then decide what they're able to do, because their influence, power, control, and capital is much greater than mine will ever be. So what I'm trying to do, and what EEI is trying to do, is to find those people and for us to create a community where they can co-create what's possible. So that's one thing. I'm always trying to I know you want to go here, but I always stay here because I understand where I can have influence in a really meaningful way. The other thing I just want to say, and Divya, you said this, is that data is a construct. It does not just exist. It is seen by humans. My husband will be really happy when I say this part. And until the synergy happens, the singularity happens, right? When AI, I'm pretty sure, is going to deem us completely useless, as happens in every single sci-fi movie, right? We still decide. We decide what we see, we decide how it's managed, how it's depicted, all of it, right? So who we are matters in what's the data we see. And the idea that digital is somehow not an expression of the human experience is just really bizarre to me. And so when we say digital infrastructure, I'm like, it's still the same people doing the same thing. And most of them don't look like us and have our political sensitivities, right? And that's just true. So, I mean, I think we can get someplace new, but I think it's going to take more than a minute, because we actually don't know what we're doing. And anyone that tells you that knows what they're doing is actually delusional. We don't know what we're doing. English is an incredibly limiting language. It's binary. It is aggressive. It has incredibly strong control and command language in it. So if you were using English, you actually cannot often you can't often say what you mean to say because the language is so limiting. And so then we get caught up in the words that we say because we don't know how to say them in another language. And we're word obsessed.
There's an important idea.
That's all I got. I'm done.
No, it's not all. It's, first of all, it's not all you got. And secondly, it's a delight to hear you when you think you're narrowing the topic. I just want to, I mean, again, I want to get Mario's response, but to me, Jara, you're reminding us again, using perhaps a limited set of English vocabulary again, that this is about relationships, and the relationships, or, you know, the white Western, certainly Silicon Valley logic that distinguishes me from my phone, from my digital network, from my institution, is by no means global, universal, or possibly even appropriate. It does, however, particularly in the political economy of ready access to digital stuff as it exists now, absolutely dominates. And so this very tiny knowledge framework and cultural set of expectations has a, you know, a colonizing force. I actually, that might, I don't want to, well, it has a force that's in many cases profoundly colonizing. I don't want to diminish the impact of colonization by using that term, but anyway, much more there to dig into. Again, I can't, the chat is now like flying by, so I'm going to go over there. But Mario, your thoughts on any of this, whether it has to do with the question that was originally asked about data in your work, or these much more interesting and complicating relational questions that Jara and Divya put on the table.
Yeah, and my apologies for not being able to respond to the chat. I just met Jara and Divya yesterday, and I love that our prep call had very little to do with what we're talking about today, but kind of revealed everyone's humanity, centered around dragons and Godzilla. And so I've just been enjoying giving my full attention to both of them. Also, I am being sleep trained by a 5-month-old, which has been challenging to say the least. I think for this question, I mean, what came to mind is the centering of, or what I center in kind of what I think about, which is movement infrastructure. And so whenever I think about digital infrastructure, how does it relate to movement infrastructure? I think, Lucy, when you and I first met, I came to you with a kind of a deep concern about the collusion between the conditions of philanthropy and hypercommunication and its impact on all of us. The ways that foundations and high net worth donors were demanding more time from organizations, leading to less time and attention to grassroots supporter, to broad bases of cross-class support, which social movements were historically kind of known for, and of civil society and democracy as a whole. And the particular, just to get to the granular, magical moments of organizing and fundraising, which before hyper communication and connectivity went something like, you know, I would knock on your door and after 5 minutes, I would say to you, we just met, but it sounds like you really care about climate, or you really care about the planet and you're concerned about climate change. And not only do you have those values and concerns, but you've taught your daughter to be a steward of the earth, and you've found ways to support leaders who've taken bold stances. You sound like someone we would love to have in our community. Would you come to the meeting on Wednesday, or would you, consider supporting us? And the person at the door thought they were being invited to a meeting or for a donation, but we knew what our actual ask was to, or our work was to conceive a version of themselves full of agency, values, and then invite them to step into that person. And if they did, it just meant so much. It was appeal not to who we were and what we were doing, but rather to who they were, offering people that conception of themselves and an accompaniment by us with them to create kind of the change that they want to see. But of course, this was replaced by email blasts, a particularly narcissistic form of communication with its promise to reach more people, but at what cost? And so that's why we piloted Giving Side, as you know. That in itself has been a long, eye-opening kind of process. And what I keep coming back to is the philanthropy and tech's mutual coveting and proselytizing of scale over almost everything, whether that be scale of capital or customers or both. And just to kind of expand on this a bit more, in social movements, like social movements have never been majority movements. They've always been critical masses of people. In workshops, I like to do this exercise where I take a photo of the March on Selma, the 600-person March on Selma, and then overlay that at scale on top of an image of the Fox Theater in Oakland with a capacity of 2,800 people on any given night, 63,000 people at the Oakland Coliseum, or 260,000 people who travel in a single day across the Bay Bridge. And then coming back to Stacey Abrams, you know, I worry that our kind of allure of scale meant that her plan had to be a 10-year plan, not because of her own capacity to achieve what she wanted to in 10 years, but because of our capacity to choose to value her and her values and her imagination and her possibility rather than scale and probability in those first few years. And the question for us is, like, do we want to be the people who supported Stacey Abrams in 2020, or do we want to be the people who supported Stacey Abrams in 2010? And how can we find that collective will to be there before scale does? And then I just worry about the weaponizing of scale. I think it might be a little strong, but you know, and Lucy, I think we've seen it in the giving space. But the ability to dismiss entire people, organizations, efforts because they're not yet at scale, to have been told, come back to me when you're at scale, feels in some ways like the way that the term civilized or uncivilized was deployed, which is a highly subjective term, right? But the use of which was able to dismiss an entire person or being. And then I just worry about our own susceptibility to the allure of scale, where so many good people are continuing to make choices to be in proximity to scale, whether that's to philanthropy or technology, rather than seeking out the places that are, you know, alternatives to that. So I'll stop there.
Mario, as always, I just gained so much from you and your work and the way you think about things. I want to go off script here for a second. So everyone who knows me will be surprised it's taken me this long. We have about 4 minutes left, but I want to ask you all a very personal question. Maybe it's not a personal question. It's a personal question for me, and it comes from an experience I've had actually with Divya, and when she and I caught up after several months of not being able to catch up because we are living in times when, you know, the amount of grief that I carry, that each of you may be carrying, that the people on this call may be carrying, the burdens of care, the uncertainty, the precariousness of daily life. I mean, I think the people who are able to be in conversations like this are by no means, you know, there are so many people for whom this is an impossible situation right now. That's just out of the realm of the possible. And Divya, if I may, Divya was telling me how she'd moved to a new city in the middle of the fall of last year, and what it meant as someone who's always, as long as I've known Divya, very engaged in community, deeply involved with others, and struggling with how you do that. And one of the things I've noticed, I am getting to a question. One of the things I've noticed in my own experience over the last many months has been that I've actually found a newfound appreciation for scale, but not at all in the way anybody else uses it. I'm talking about depth, not breadth. And it's in my personal ability to be part of my community, which, like perhaps many of you, my world has now confined to about 6 blocks. But I have had the chance to get deeply engaged with dozens of my neighbors. And instead of being part of broader communities or doing work, I mentioned I've been engaged with Glide for years, and Femi Asoke has been a critical part of my. I've really begun to focus my energies and receiving energies on about a half dozen people who are not formal members of my family, but they're certainly my chosen family now, but they're neighbors. They're people in the city of San Francisco who I've come to know and who give me joy and power by being in community with them. And so it's a question for all of you about these experiences we're collectively having, some of us in very, each of us in our own ways, and some communities in very violent ways compared to others. But if any of you want to share something that you've noticed in your own self about these phrases we use. I've been a critic of scale and philanthropy since I first heard it. But what I find now is my place in community comes from deeply engaging with a very small number of people. And I'm wondering if anyone else has anything to share on that you feel comfortable putting out.
Aren't they going to cut us off in like a minute?
Yep. So you can use that as an out, but if not, I will just have wrapped up this conversation with a.
I guess I would say, and I've been thinking about this, is that what I realize is that what I require to do this work in this moment is to be in deep, intimate relationships with folks. And who and what they look like is irrelevant to me. It's the heart and authenticity and integrity that they bring forward. And it's been interesting to develop those relationships virtually by not being in physical proximity.
Yeah, and I think it's been a really beautiful reminder of bridging the abstract and the concrete in terms of our visions for the future, where we are seeing, as you wrote in Blueprint, the syndemic crisis, the breakdown of such vast systems, much bigger than many of us can really grok or imagine, and yet the violence of those systems is very concrete. And so our response, the vision, should match that level of, of possibility, and yet also be very tied and grounded in the work that we can do in our communities. And Lucy, as you mentioned, it's been, particularly interesting for me trying to build that community in a new space during this pandemic. And what has kept me sort of going is the distributed network through which we can do that grounded work, even if, grounding in physical spaces in the way that I normally love and generates for me is much more difficult.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you, Jara. Mario?
And just for me, despite the title, Senior Innovation Director, I'm troubled by the word innovation, because I think this past year has led me to think more about collective action as a muscle, about the importance of ritual and practice, which I think innovation has pulled us away from, to kind of value the new thing versus the old thing, where, collective action's a muscle, democracy is a muscle, and how do we kind of find our ways back to that? What is the Peloton of democracy? Sorry, just trying to drop in words from our
there you go. That one gets a prize, as does Gazilla. I want to ask everyone who's already started thanking you for this extraordinary conversation. But from me, thank you for all that you do, for being here with me today and in every day of my life. And best of luck with all of you, to everyone on the chat, and certainly to Jara, Mario, and Divya. Thank you for all that you've given me. Michael, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks to SSIR. I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Lucy. And I'd also like to thank Jara and Mario and Divya for joining us today. I know that we've only scratched the surface of some of those topics, but I'm hopeful that today's discussion will encourage more conversation, more introspection, and ultimately encourage each of us to be part as both individuals and organizational leaders in this work. As I mentioned before, today's session was part of the 2021 Data on Purpose conference that kicks off officially tomorrow morning. If you aren't already registered to attend the conference, I'd encourage you to consider doing so. You can find out more by visiting ssirdata.org. I'd also encourage you to visit ssir.org, where we've curated a bunch of articles related to the themes of this year's conference. And finally, I'd like to once again thank Stanford PACS for making this session possible and encourage you to visit PACS Center, PACS Center.stanford.edu. Thanks, everyone.